3 true night shift horror stories. Story 1. The night janitor who found a locked room that wasn't on any blueprints. The soft hum of fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, a familiar sound that faded into the background as Edward Hargrove pushed his mop bucket down the dark hallway of the 12th floor. The building had been quiet for weeks. Most of the offices were empty, tenants long gone. It was a forgotten space, abandoned like the rest of the aging structure. Edward liked the quiet. He liked routine, the same floors, the same hallways, the same mindless work. It kept him moving, kept him from thinking too much about the things he couldn't change. Tonight, though, something felt off. As he rounded the corner at the end of the hall, he stopped abruptly, his brow furrowed. There was a door he didn't recognize. It shouldn't have been there. For 10 years, Edward had cleaned this building every night. He knew every door, every hallway, every crack in the plaster. But this door? He'd never seen it before. The door stood at the very end of the hallway, partially hidden in shadow. The paint was chipped and peeling, the brass handle tarnished with age. There was no room number, no sign, just a plain locked door. Edward stood there for a moment, staring at it. Weird. He shook his head, pulling out his keys. He had a ring full of them, keys for offices that no longer existed, for desks and filing cabinets that hadn't been touched in years. His fingers hovered over one of the oldest keys, its label worn away by time. Probably just a storage room, he thought, slipping the key into the lock. It turned easily. The door creaked open, releasing a stale, musty smell into the air. Edward wrinkled his nose and reached for the light switch inside. The bulb flickered to life, casting dim, yellow light over the room's contents. And what he saw stopped him cold. The room was filled with old furniture, stacks of papers, and personal belongings, all covered in a thick layer of dust. It looked like no one had set foot in the room for decades. In the corner sat a leather briefcase, worn and cracked with age. On the desk, a coffee mug sat beside a typewriter, with half-typed paper still in the roller. Edward's eyes drifted to the walls, corkboards filled with black and white photos of people in office settings, smiling stiffly for the camera. Everything about the room felt frozen in time, but what caught Edward's attention most was the calendar pinned to the wall. The date was September 19th, 1987. 38 years ago. He frowned, stepping closer to the desk. He flipped through the stack of papers, pay stubs, memos, meeting notes, all dated from the same week in 1987. Edward felt a chill creep up his spine. None of this should have been here. The building had been renovated in the early 2000s. This floor had been gutted, remodeled, and leased out. There was no way a room like this could have been left behind. He picked up a photograph from the desk, a group shot of employees, all smiling in front of the building's entrance. There were about 20 people in the picture, but one man caught Edward's attention. He stood slightly apart from the group, his expression serious, almost grim. His face was lean, his eyes sharp. Something about him felt familiar. Edward flipped the photo over. There was a name written on the back in faded ink. Daniel Fisher. Edward's gaze drifted back to the desk. There was a file folder, partially hidden beneath the typewriter. He pulled it out, brushing the dust off the cover. The label read, Incident Report, 12th Floor, Confidential. His pulse quickened. He opened the file and scanned the first page. A single line stood out, written in bold letters. Employee presumed deceased. Cause, confinement within locked room. No recovery. Edward's hands trembled as he flipped to the next page. There were gruesome details, photos of charred walls, diagrams of the room's layout, and handwritten witness statements. The report described a fire that had broken out on the 12th floor, trapping one employee inside. But what made Edward's blood run cold was the final line of the report. Door sealed on September 19th, 1987. Room erased from blueprints per management directive. Edward stepped back from the desk, his mind racing. His gaze darted back to the calendar on the wall. September 19th, 1987. The date the door was sealed. The date someone was left inside to die. Edward swallowed hard, his mouth dry. He turned toward the door, ready to leave, but something caught his eye. There was a pair of shoes neatly placed by the door. They were men's dress shoes, covered in dust, and they were pointing toward the door, as if someone had been standing there, waiting to leave. Edward's heart pounded as he hurried out of the room, slamming the door shut behind him. He stood in the hallway, gasping for air, his hands shaking. What the hell was that? He glanced down the hall toward the elevators. Everything looked normal again, quiet, empty, abandoned. But as he turned to leave, he noticed something chilling. The handle of the door was slowly turning. The next night, Edward returned to the 12th floor with a sinking feeling in his gut. His footsteps echoed through the empty hallway. As he pushed his mop bucket along, his hands trembling slightly. The faint smell of bleach clung to the air, mingling with the building's stale, musty scent. He reached the spot where the door should have been, but it was gone. The hallway ended in a blank wall. Edward froze, his heart pounding in his chest. No, it was here. He ran his fingers over the plaster, pressing along the wall. There was no seam, no sign that a door had ever existed. He stood there for several minutes, staring at the wall, his mind racing. It didn't make sense. He'd been in that room less than 24 hours ago. He'd seen the furniture, the files, the photos. He reached into his pocket, pulling out the photograph he had taken from the room. Daniel Fisher's face stared back at him, that same grim expression etched into his features. It was real. I was there. But now, the room was gone. As Edward stood there, a cold breeze swept down the hallway, making him shiver. The air felt wrong, too cold for an indoor building. He glanced around, expecting to see a window open or a draft coming through. But the windows were all sealed. The hallway was empty. Then he heard it, a faint whisper. "Edward!" He spun around, his heart hammering. Did someone just say my name? He scanned the empty hallway, but there was no one there. The whisper had sounded distant, like it came from deep inside the walls. Edward shook his head, trying to steady himself. I'm losing it. That's all this is, just tired, overworked. But as he turned to leave, he caught something out of the corner of his eye. On the blank wall where the door had been, there was now a faint outline, a shadow of a doorframe, just barely visible. Edward backed away slowly, a chill crawling up his spine. He fumbled for his phone, taking a picture of the wall. As the flash went off, the hallway lights flickered. For a split second, the shadow of a figure appeared in the reflection of his phone screen, standing right behind him. Edward whipped around. No one was there. But the cold, sinking feeling in his gut wouldn't go away. That night, Edward couldn't sleep. He sat at his kitchen table, staring at the photograph of Daniel Fisher. His mind kept returning to the report he'd found in the room. The fire, the locked door, the man left inside to die. He pulled out the file folder and flipped through the pages again, searching for anything he might have missed. His fingers stopped on a diagram of the 12th floor layout. The diagram showed no room at the end of the hall. The blueprints ended exactly where the wall now stood. It was never supposed to exist, but what troubled Edward most was a handwritten note scrawled at the bottom of the report. Room erased from blueprints as per management directive, door sealed, incident covered up. His hands trembled as he read the next line. Do not reopen. The next night, Edward returned to the building with a growing sense of dread. He needed answers. He needed to know why the room disappeared. And more than that, he needed to know what really happened to Daniel Fisher. He took the elevator to the 12th floor and stepped out into the hallway. The air felt different, heavier, like the building itself was holding its breath. He walked slowly toward the spot where the door had been. The hallway was silent. He reached out, running his hand along the wall. There was still no sign of the door, but as he turned to leave, he heard a soft creak. Edward froze. Behind him, the door was back. His heart pounded as he stepped closer. The door looked the same as it had the first night. Old, weathered, and locked. But now, the handle was turning on its own. Edward staggered back, his breath catching in his throat. This isn't real. This can't be real. The door swung open slowly, revealing the dark, dusty room inside. But something was different. The furniture was still there. The desk, the typewriter, the calendar. But the photograph of Daniel Fisher was gone. In its place was a new photo. Edward stepped closer, his hands trembling as he picked it up. The photo showed a man standing in the middle of the room, staring directly at the camera. It was Edward. His breath quickened. His mind spun. Number? That's impossible. He stared at the photo, his own eyes staring back at him, expressionless. Then, the lights flickered. The air grew frigid. Edward's breath puffed out in white clouds, and behind him, he heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate. Edward turned slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. A figure stood in the doorway, tall, dark. His face was obscured by shadow, but as he stepped forward, Edward recognized him. Daniel Fisher. His clothes were tattered and burned. His skin was charred, his eyes milky white, but his expression was unmistakable. It was pure rage. Edward backed away, stumbling over the desk. No! You're dead. You died in that room. Daniel stepped closer, his voice low and cold. You let it happen. Edward shook his head. I didn't know. I swear, I didn't know. Daniel's voice rose, echoing through the room. You locked the door. Edward's blood ran cold. I I was just following orders. I didn't know you were inside. Daniel's charred face twisted into a cruel smile. And now, it's your turn. The door slammed shut, trapping Edward inside. The sound of the door slamming shut echoed through the dark room, reverberating in Edward's ears like a gunshot. He stumbled backward, knocking over a chair as he scrambled to his feet. His breathing was ragged, his heart pounding in his chest. The air felt thick and suffocating, laced with the scent of burned wood and smoke. The door, his only way out, was gone. He spun around, searching for an exit, but the walls seemed to close in on him, twisting and warping in the dim light. The room felt smaller now, more oppressive. Shadows stretched along the walls like grasping hands. And then he heard it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, approaching from somewhere behind him. "No," Edward whispered, shaking his head. "This isn't real." But the footsteps didn't stop. They grew louder, closer, echoing through the empty space. Edward turned, his hands trembling, and saw the figure stepping out of the shadows. It was Daniel Fisher. His face was twisted with rage, his skin charred and cracked from long-forgotten flames. His eyes were white and hollow, like they had been burned away, yet somehow he still saw everything. "You let me die." Daniel's voice was low and guttural, filled with pain and fury. "You locked the door. You left me there." Edward backed away, his mind spinning. The memories he'd buried for decades came rushing back, unrelenting and cruel. It was September 19th, 1987. Edward was younger then, a security guard at the building. He remembered the late-night call from his supervisor. "There's a situation on the 12th floor. Some guy found something he wasn't supposed to. Lock the door. Don't let him out." Edward had followed orders without question. He'd locked the door and walked away, unaware, or maybe unwilling to admit, that there was someone still inside. By the time he realized what had happened, it was too late. The fire broke out hours later. The building's management covered up the incident, erasing Daniel Fisher's existence from the records. And Edward, he moved on. He buried the guilt deep, convincing himself it wasn't his fault. But now, standing in this cursed room, there was no escaping the truth. "I didn't know you were still in there," Edward whispered, tears streaming down his face. "I didn't know." Daniel stepped closer, his burned face twisted into a cruel smile. "You knew enough." The air grew colder, and Edward shivered as the lights flickered. Shadows crawled along the walls, twisting into horrific shapes, faces screaming in agony. The typewriter on the desk began to click on its own, the keys pounding out a message: "No one gets out." Edward stumbled backward, his chest heaving. The room began to change. The walls cracked and peeled, revealing charred wood and blackened plaster beneath. The shadows flickered with phantom flames. The calendar on the wall flipped rapidly, the pages tearing away until it landed on September 19th, 1987. The door reappeared, but it wasn't the same door. The frame was warped, the wood blackened and burned. Smoke curled from the edges, and a faint orange glow flickered from behind it, as if the fire still raged on the other side. Edward took a step toward it, desperate to escape, but Daniel's voice stopped him cold. "You can't leave." Edward turned, his heart pounding. Daniel stood inches away now, his burned face contorted with hatred. "You locked me in here. Now it's your turn." Edward staggered backward, shaking his head. "No, I didn't mean to. I didn't know." Daniel's voice rose, a deafening roar of anger and pain. "You left me to die!" The walls shook, the shadows twisting into horrific figures, burned bodies writhing in agony. The air filled with the sound of screaming. Edward collapsed to his knees, clutching his head. "I'm sorry!" he cried, his voice breaking. "I'm sorry!" But the screaming didn't stop. Suddenly, the screaming faded into whispers. Edward lifted his head, his breath ragged. The shadows on the walls began to move again, forming words written in blackened ash. "Confess. Admit what you did. Face your punishment." Edward sobbed, his hands trembling. His mind was unraveling. As Edward sat there, broken and trembling, he finally understood. This wasn't just about Daniel Fisher. This was about every choice he'd made to turn away. Every moment of cowardice, every lie he had told himself to sleep at night. The locked room wasn't just a physical space. It was a prison for his sins. And now, it was his turn to suffer. The door behind him creaked open. Edward turned slowly, his heart pounding. On the other side of the door, he saw himself. But it wasn't the man he was now. It was the younger version of himself, the security guard who had locked the door that night, expressionless and cold. The younger Edward stared at him, his eyes filled with emptiness. "Time to go back inside," the younger version said. Edward shook his head, tears streaming down his face. "No, please." But the younger Edward didn't care. He stepped forward, grabbed Edward by the shoulders, and dragged him through the burning door. Edward screamed as the flames consumed him. The fire was everywhere, hot, choking, blinding. But through the flames, he heard Daniel's voice. "You'll never forget." Edward's screams echoed through the room as the door slammed shut behind him. And then the room fell silent. The door slammed shut, trapping Edward in the burning room. His screams echoed through the space, blending with the crackling of flames and the distant ghostly cries of those who had been trapped before him. But just as the fire engulfed him, everything stopped. The flames vanished. The heat disappeared. The room fell into complete silence. Edward opened his eyes. He was standing in the hallway. His heart raced as he spun around. The door was gone. The wall stood blank and unmarked, just like before. He stumbled backward, his breath coming in shallow gasps. Was it over? His trembling hands reached into his pocket. He pulled out the photograph. His eyes widened in horror. It had changed. Where before it showed Daniel Fisher, it now showed Edward, standing alone in the room, staring at the camera. His eyes were empty, his expression cold and hollow. He dropped the photo, his hands shaking. The hallway was eerily quiet. Too quiet. Edward stumbled toward the elevators, desperate to leave. His legs felt heavy, as if the weight of everything he'd done was pressing down on him. As he reached the elevator, he pressed the button repeatedly, his fingers trembling. The light above the doors flickered on, and the elevator arrived with a soft ding. The doors slid open. Inside stood Daniel Fisher. Edward froze. Daniel stared at him, his burned, twisted face expressionless. His hollow eyes locked onto Edward's, and for a long, agonizing moment, neither of them moved. Then Daniel spoke, his voice low and cold, like the whisper of smoke through ashes. "You're not done." Edward shook his head, stepping back. No. I did what you wanted. I confessed. I'm sorry. Daniel stepped out of the elevator, slowly advancing toward him. "Sorry?" His voice was laced with bitter rage. "You think this ends with an apology?" Edward stumbled backward, his mind spiraling into panic. "What do you want from me?" he cried, his voice breaking. "I can't change the past." Daniel stopped inches away, his burned face twisted into a cruel smile. This was never about the past. Edward's breath caught in his throat. Daniel leaned in, his voice a whisper. "This is about what comes next." Suddenly, the hallway began to change. The walls warped and twisted, darkening with soot and ash. The air grew heavy with the scent of burned wood and charred flesh. Edward turned to run, but the hallway stretched endlessly. No matter how fast he ran, the end never came. Doors appeared on either side of him, slamming open and shut, revealing glimpses of the horrors inside. Burned bodies, empty desks covered in ash, faces twisted in agony. And everywhere he looked, Daniel was there, watching him. Finally, Edward collapsed to the ground, gasping for air. The walls closed in, the shadows pressing down on him, and then he heard it again. The typewriter. Click, click, click. The sound echoed through the hallway, relentless and rhythmic. Edward turned, his eyes wide with terror. There, in the middle of the hallway, a desk appeared, and on the desk sat a typewriter, old, black, and covered in dust. The keys pounded on their own, typing out a message in perfect rhythm. Edward crawled toward the desk, his hands trembling. The message on the paper read, "No one gets out." Edward shook his head, tears streaming down his face. "Please, no!" Suddenly, the typewriter stopped. The room fell silent. Then, the phone on the desk rang. Edward froze. The sound was deafening in the silence, a shrill, piercing ring that seemed to cut through his very soul. The phone kept ringing, demanding to be answered. Slowly, reluctantly, Edward reached out and picked up the receiver. His hand shook as he lifted it to his ear. "Hello?" he whispered. For a moment, there was only static. Then faintly a voice came through the line. "Edward!" His blood ran cold. "Daniel?" The voice on the other end was calm and quiet, but it wasn't Daniel. It was himself. "It's time to start your shift." Edward dropped the phone, stumbling backward. The walls of the hallway began to twist and collapse, folding in on themselves like a crumbling labyrinth. The doors slammed shut one by one, their echoes reverberating through the darkness. Finally, the door to the locked room reappeared. This time, it was wide open. Inside, Edward saw a desk, his desk. And on the desk sat the typewriter, the photograph, and the calendar, stuck on September 19th, 1987. Edward stepped forward, his legs moving on their own. The walls around him faded into a dull, gray void. The only thing that remained was the room, and the endless silence. He sat down at the desk, staring at the typewriter. His fingers hovered over the keys. The calendar flipped forward, day by day, year by year, until it landed on today's date. Edward's reflection stared back at him from the blank window, but it wasn't his face anymore. It was Daniel's. And as Edward sat there, the door slowly swung shut. With a soft, final click, it locked. The building stood silent in the early morning light. The demolition crew arrived, preparing to tear down the forgotten structure. One worker glanced up at the windows of the 12th floor. He thought for a moment that he saw someone standing there, watching. But when he looked again, the window was empty. Inside, the typewriter clicked, and Edward, now trapped forever, kept typing. Because no one gets out. The end. Story 2. The 911 dispatcher's final call of the night. The clock on the wall ticked like a heartbeat, each second dragging Helen closer to freedom. 11:54 p.m. 6 more minutes. After 32 years as a 911 dispatcher, this was supposed to be her last shift. Her final night of listening to desperate voices, shattered lives, and death creeping through the line. She had counted down the hours, waiting for midnight to free her from a job that had long since hardened her heart and frayed her soul. The office was quiet now. Most of the other dispatchers had already gone home, leaving Helen alone in the dim light. The hum of computers was the only sound, a soft drone that filled the silence like static. She glanced at the retirement card sitting on her desk, covered in hastily scribbled messages from her co-workers. "We'll miss you, Helen. Good luck. You've earned it." But Helen didn't feel like she'd earned anything. The weight of every voice she couldn't save still sat heavy on her shoulders. She reached for her bag, ready to walk away from this chapter of her life for good. That's when the phone rang. Helen froze. Her eyes flicked to the clock again. 11:55 p.m. Just 5 more minutes and someone else could have taken the call. Someone younger, someone who still had hope. But there was no one left in the office. The phone rang again, louder this time. Helen sighed, sitting back down. She placed the headset over her ears with the kind of practiced ease that comes from a lifetime of doing the same thing over and over. 911, what's your emergency? At first, there was only silence. Helen frowned. She was about to ask again when a soft sob echoed through the line. A woman's voice, broken and trembling. Please help me." Helen straightened, the exhaustion vanishing from her body. Her tone shifted to calm professionalism, masking the flicker of unease crawling up her spine. "Ma'am, this is 911. I need you to tell me what's happening. Are you in danger?" The woman's breath hitched. "Yes, he's inside the house. I can hear him. He's looking for me." Helen's fingers hovered over the keyboard, typing quickly. "A home invasion. Suspect inside." Her mind raced through the procedure she knew by heart. Keep the caller calm, get the location, stay on the line. "What's your name?" Helen asked. A long pause, then, barely a whisper, "Marie?" Helen's fingers froze mid-type. The name hit her like a cold wind through an open window. It was familiar. Helen tried to shake off the feeling, focusing on the task at hand. "Okay, Marie, I need you to stay as calm as you can. Where are you right now?" Marie's voice trembled. I'm hiding in a closet, upstairs. He hasn't found me yet." Helen nodded to herself. She typed the address Marie gave her and dispatched officers to the scene. But the unease in her chest grew stronger. There was something about the way Marie spoke, something haunting, something wrong. Suddenly the sound of footsteps echoed through the phone, slow, deliberate, growing louder. Helen leaned in, her heartbeat quickening. "Marie, is that him?" Marie whimpered softly. "Yes." Helen kept her voice steady. "Okay, listen to me. Stay quiet. Don't make a sound. The police are on their way." The footsteps grew closer, heavier. Helen could hear the floor creaking beneath the intruder's weight. She imagined Marie pressed against the wall, barely breathing, her heart pounding loud enough to give her away. "He's at the door," Marie whispered, her voice cracking with fear. "Oh God, he's going to find me." Helen's fingers hovered over the keyboard, unsure of what more she could do. She'd handled hundreds of calls like this, people trapped, terrified, begging for help. But this one felt different. The way Marie said her name, the way her voice cracked with desperation. It stirred something in Helen's memory, something she couldn't quite place. Then, through the phone, there was a click. Helen's heart stopped, the sound of the closet door creaking open. Marie gasped. "No! No!" Helen leaned forward, her voice urgent. "Marie, stay calm. Help is almost there." A low, deep voice broke through the line. "Hello, Helen." Helen froze. Her blood turned to ice. her fingers hovering over the keyboard, slowly curled into fists. The voice was calm, familiar, too familiar. "It's been a long time," the voice said softly. Helen's mind reeled. It couldn't be. It wasn't possible. "Do you remember me?" the voice asked. Helen's mouth went dry. Her heart pounded in her chest like a drum beat. She had heard this voice before, years ago. The voice chuckled. It was a soft, chilling sound that sent shivers down Helen's spine. "You thought you could forget. You thought you could move on." Helen's hands shook. Her mind flooded with memories she had tried to bury. Memories of a boy's voice crying for help, of a call that came too late, of a young life snuffed out because of her mistake. "But I never forgot," the voice said, his tone darkening. "And tonight, you're going to listen to me." Helen's heart stopped as the truth slammed into her like a freight train. The man on the other end of the line wasn't just any intruder. He was a ghost from her past, and he wasn't finished with her yet. Helen sat frozen in her chair, her hands trembling as she gripped the headset. The voice on the other end of the line sent shivers down her spine, a voice she hadn't heard in years, one she'd hoped to never hear again. "Do you remember me?" the man asked softly. Helen swallowed hard, her mouth dry. She tried to regain her composure, her voice steady, professional. "Sir, I'm going to need you to identify yourself." The man laughed quietly, a low, chilling sound. "Still playing by the rules, I see. But this isn't a game, Helen. Not anymore." In the background, she could hear Marie's ragged breathing. The woman was still there, still terrified, trapped in her own home with a monster lurking in the dark. Helen forced herself to focus. "Marie, are you still there?" Marie's voice came through the line, trembling. He's standing right outside the closet." Helen's heart pounded. Every second mattered. "Marie, stay quiet. Help is on the way." The man chuckled again, cutting through Helen's words like a knife. "Help isn't coming in time. You know that better than anyone, don't you?" Helen gritted her teeth. "Who are you?" The voice dropped lower, colder. "You know who I am." Helen's mind spun as she searched her memory, dredging up a buried nightmare she had fought for years to forget. It was nearly 15 years ago. A call from a terrified boy, maybe 9 or 10 years old. His voice shook as he begged for help, crying about someone banging on the door. Helen had followed protocol, tried to keep him calm, but she couldn't get a clear address from him. The line cut out before she could trace the call. The boy's body was found the next morning, beaten, broken, lifeless. And Helen had carried that failure with her every day since. The man's voice broke through her thoughts, pulling her back to the present. "I begged for help." His tone was calm, steady, but beneath it lay a storm of rage and grief. "I begged you to save me, and you didn't." Helen's hands trembled as she clutched the headset. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to block out the memory of that boy's voice. I tried," she whispered. "Not hard enough," the man spat. "You left me to die." Helen forced herself to breathe, to push back the rising panic. "I'm sorry, I am, but this isn't the way to make things right." The man laughed again. This time, it was hollow, bitter. "Right? There's no making it right. I'm not here for forgiveness." "Then what do you want?" Helen asked, her voice trembling. The man's response was simple, cold. "I want you to feel what it's like to be powerless." In the background, Marie whimpered, "Please, please don't hurt me." Helen's heart twisted painfully. She leaned forward, desperation in her voice. "Listen to me. You don't have to hurt anyone. We can talk about this. We can fix it." "Fix it?" The man's voice was mocking. "You're still delusional, Helen. There's nothing to fix. There's only the truth. And tonight, you're going to listen to it." Helen's mind raced. She needed to stall him, keep him talking until the police arrived. But the man wasn't interested in games. His tone darkened, his words cutting like a scalpel. "She's scared, isn't she? Just like I was." Helen's stomach churned. He was enjoying this, relishing the fear, the power. "Please," Helen whispered, "let her go." "Why should I?" he shot back. "No one came for me. No one saved me. Why does she deserve to be saved?" Helen closed her eyes, tears threatening to spill. Guilt suffocated her. She had spent years convincing herself she did everything she could that night, but deep down, she knew it wasn't true. She failed that boy. And now, his ghost had come back to haunt her. "You always follow the rules, don't you, Helen?" the man continued. "You always do what you're supposed to do. But what happens when the rules don't work? What happens when the system fails?" Helen's voice cracked. "I'm trying to help her. Just like you tried to help me?" Silence hung heavy over the line. Then, softly, "He's opening the door." Marie's terrified whisper cut through the tension like a knife. Helen's pulse spiked. "Marie, stay quiet. Stay hidden, please." But it was too late. Helen heard the door creak open. "No," she whispered. Then came the scream. The line crackled with static. Helen sat frozen, her heart pounding in her chest. "Marie," she called, panic rising. "Marie, are you there?" Silence. Then the man's voice again, calm, cold, and terrifying. "Are you listening now, Helen?" The line crackled with static, the sound twisting into a low hum that seemed to burrow into Helen's skull. Her hands trembled as she gripped the headset, her knuckles white. Her chest felt tight, as if invisible hands were squeezing the air out of her lungs. "Marie?" she whispered. "Marie, answer me." Silence. Helen's mind raced, grasping for possibilities. Maybe Marie had dropped the phone. Maybe she was still hiding, too scared to speak. Maybe... The man's voice returned, cutting through the static like a razor. "She's gone, Helen." Helen's heart stopped. No, that's not possible. She was just... Her voice trailed off, her breath catching in her throat. The man chuckled softly. "You couldn't save me, and now you couldn't save her." Helen leaned forward, her forehead pressing against the desk. Her mind spun with fragments of memory, flashes of the past. The boy's voice, his cries for help, the sound of the line going dead. For years she had convinced herself that it wasn't her fault, that she had done everything she could, but deep down, she knew it was a lie. The man on the line was proof. "Why are you doing this?" Helen asked, her voice cracking. The man's tone darkened, the playful mockery replaced with raw, simmering rage. "Because you never answered for what you did." Helen shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "I tried to save you. I tried." "Tried?" The word dripped with venom. "Do you think that matters? Do you think my parents cared that you tried? Do you think they were comforted when they buried me?" Helen winced, his words hitting her like a physical blow. "You went home that night," he continued. "You went to bed. You moved on. But I was left in the dark, alone, forgotten." Helen's stomach twisted with guilt. She remembered the news reports, the boy's name, his picture in the papers. She had tried to forget, tried to bury it deep. But the boy's ghost had never left her. The man's voice softened, turning cold and calculating. "I spent years waiting for this moment, Helen. Planning it. I wanted you to feel what it's like to be helpless, to hear someone beg for their life and know there's nothing you can do." Helen wiped her eyes, forcing herself to breathe. "It doesn't have to be like this," she whispered. "You can still stop." "Why would I stop?" he sneered. "I'm just getting started." Helen glanced at the police dispatch screen. The officers she had sent to Marie's address were still en route, but she knew it wouldn't be fast enough. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. She wanted to call in more backup, but her hands felt frozen, paralyzed by the weight of the moment. "What do you want from me?" she finally asked. The man was silent for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter, more dangerous. "I want you to confess." Helen blinked, confusion cutting through her fear. "Confess?" "I want you to admit what you did. I want you to say it out loud, so everyone can hear." Helen's pulse quickened. "That's not going to change anything." "It'll change everything for you," he said, his voice sharp and cruel. "Because the moment you say it, you'll finally become what you've always been. A failure, a liar, a murderer." Helen clenched her fists. "I'm not a murderer." The man laughed softly. "Aren't you? You left me to die. That makes you just as guilty as the man who killed me." Helen shook her head, her vision blurring with tears. "It was an accident. I couldn't get to you in time." "You could have done more," he snapped, the rage boiling over. "You could have saved me, but you didn't. You followed your precious rules instead of listening to me." The truth cut deep. Helen had always prided herself on her professionalism, her ability to follow protocol. But that night, those very rules had cost a boy his life. The man's voice softened again, turning icy. "Confess, Helen. Tell the world what you did, and maybe, just maybe, I'll let Marie live." Helen's heart pounded in her chest. The weight of his ultimatum pressed down on her like a crushing boulder. If she confessed, she would lose everything: her reputation, her career, her freedom. The police would investigate, the press would swarm her life would be over. But if she didn't confess, Marie would die. Helen clenched her jaw, forcing herself to focus. "You said she's gone. What does that mean?" The man chuckled darkly. "You don't get to ask questions, Helen. Not anymore." Helen's fingers hovered over the radio switch. Her entire body trembled. She was trapped, caught between her guilt and her fear. "Time's running out," the man whispered. In the background, Helen heard the faintest sound, a muffled sob. Her eyes widened. Marie. She wasn't dead. Not yet. Helen leaned forward, desperation surging through her. "Marie, if you can hear me, say something, please." There was a long pause, then faintly, "I'm here. I'm hiding." Relief washed over Helen like a wave, but it was short-lived. The man's voice darkened. "Wrong move, Helen." Suddenly there was a loud crash through the phone. Marie screamed. Helen's blood ran cold. "No!" she shouted. "Stop!" The man didn't stop, and this time the line went dead. "Marie!" Helen's voice cracked with desperation as she shouted into the dead line. "Marie, answer me!" Silence. Helen ripped off her headset, slamming her fist on the desk. The clatter echoed through the empty office, but it did nothing to drown out the choking guilt tightening around her throat. She grabbed the headset again, dialing into the police dispatch. "Unit 4, what's your ETA?" The officer on the other end responded calmly. "Still en route, about 8 minutes out." "Hurry." Helen's voice trembled. "There's an intruder inside. The victim's in immediate danger." "Understood." Helen leaned back in her chair, staring at the blinking lights on her console. The office was too quiet, too empty. Her own heartbeat was the only sound in her ears, thudding like a drum of doom. 8 minutes. 8 minutes might as well be a lifetime. I need to do something. I can't just sit here. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. She began searching through police records, trying to dig up any information on Marie Winters. As the search results loaded, her mind spiraled into dark memories. The boy's voice echoed in her head. "Please, help me." She could still hear his cries, still feel the weight of that call from years ago, the call that had haunted her every waking moment. His name was Ethan Winters. The name flashed across the screen now, glaring back at her like a ghost returning to drag her down. Helen's chest tightened, her vision blurred with tears. Ethan was Marie's brother. She remembered the case now, a violent home, an abusive father. Ethan had called for help the night his father's rage boiled over. Helen had tried to keep him on the line, tried to get the address. But the boy had panicked, dropping the phone. By the time the police arrived, it was too late. Ethan was dead, beaten to death by his father, and Helen had never forgiven herself. The computer beeped, pulling her from her thoughts. Her search results loaded on the screen. Marie Winters, age 33. Last known address, redacted. Helen frowned. The details were sparse. But there was one thing that stood out. A notation in the record. Moved to an undisclosed location after multiple threats from surviving family members. Her stomach twisted. Marie had been in hiding, and now someone had found her. The phone rang again. Helen's heart stopped. She stared at it for a moment, her mind spinning with possibilities. Then, with trembling hands, she pressed the button and slipped the headset back on. 911, what's your emergency? A soft chuckle came through the line. The man. Miss me? Helen's breath hitched. Her fingers tightened around the headset. Where's Marie? She demanded. The man ignored her question. His voice was calm, measured. I've been thinking about that night, Helen. The night you let me die. Helen shook her head. I didn't let you die. I tried to save you. The man's voice sharpened. You didn't try hard enough. Helen squeezed her eyes shut. The guilt was suffocating. She couldn't argue with him. She couldn't erase what had happened. Where is she? She asked again, more desperate now. The man chuckled again. She's right here with me. Helen's stomach dropped. Put her on the phone. There was a pause. Then faintly Helen heard Marie sobbing in the background. Marie, Helen called. Marie, can you hear me? Marie's voice was weak, trembling. Please, help me. Helen's heart shattered. The man spoke again, his voice darker now. I gave you a chance to confess, Helen. I gave you a way out. But you didn't take it. Helen's hands shook. I'll confess. Just let her go. Too late. The sound of a knife scraping against something metal came through the line. Helen's stomach turned. What are you doing? The man's voice softened, almost tender. I'm making sure you'll never forget again. Suddenly, there was a scream. It tore through the phone, raw and agonizing. Helen bolted upright, clutching the headset. Stop! Please! The scream cut off abruptly, replaced by heavy breathing. Helen's vision blurred with tears. Her mind spun with helpless rage and grief. Why are you doing this? She whispered. The man's voice dropped to a chilling whisper. Because you left me to die. The line crackled with static again. For a moment, Helen thought the call had ended. Then the man spoke one final time. 8 minutes, Helen. 8 minutes is all it would have taken to save me, but you were too slow. Helen's heart stopped, and now she'll bleed for every second you wasted. The line went dead. Helen sat frozen in her chair, her breath shallow, her mind spinning. 8 minutes. The man's words echoed in her head like a death sentence. 8 minutes is all it would have taken to save me. She glanced at the clock on the wall. The seconds ticked by, slow and merciless. 4 minutes until the police arrived. 4 minutes that felt like an eternity. She wiped her trembling hands on her pants, trying to steady herself. Marie's scream still echoed in her ears. The sound of pure, unfiltered agony. The sound of someone realizing that help wasn't coming. It was the same scream Helen had heard all those years ago, the same scream from Ethan Winters, and now she was hearing it again. "No more," Helen whispered to herself, her voice cracking. "No more." She grabbed the phone and dialed the police dispatch. "This is Helen Carter. Where are the responding officers?" The dispatcher's voice was calm, detached. "Unit 4 is 3 minutes out." 3 minutes? 3 minutes between life and death. But Helen knew the truth. 3 minutes wouldn't be fast enough. The phone rang again. Helen's heart jumped into her throat. She stared at the blinking light on her console, her mind screaming at her not to answer, but she couldn't help herself. Her fingers trembled as she pressed the button and lifted the headset. "Helen," the man said softly, his tone dripping with malice. "Are you counting down the seconds?" Helen's jaw clenched. "Put her back on the phone." The man chuckled, a dark, hollow sound. "Why? So you can hear her die?" Helen's heart twisted painfully in her chest. "You don't have to do this," she whispered. "You've made your point. I'm listening." The man's tone hardened. "Too little, too late. You listened to me once before, remember? You told me help was coming. You told me to stay calm." Helen's breath hitched. "I was trying to keep you safe." The man's voice cracked with rage. "You were trying to shut me up!" Helen's mind reeled. She could feel herself unraveling, the cracks in her composure widening. "You want me to confess?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Fine, I confess. I failed you. I failed Ethan. I wasn't fast enough. I wasn't good enough." The man was silent for a long moment. Then he whispered, "It's not enough." Helen squeezed her eyes shut. "What more do you want from me?" The man's voice softened, becoming eerily calm. "I want you to know that this is your fault." Helen's hands clenched into fists. "You can blame me all you want," she said, her voice shaking with anger. "But you're the one doing this now. You're the one hurting her, not me." The man chuckled darkly. "Is that what you tell yourself? That you're not responsible? That you're innocent?" Helen's heart pounded in her chest. She opened her mouth to respond, but the man cut her off. "Let me ask you something, Helen. When you go to bed at night, do you hear his voice?" Helen froze. "Do you hear Ethan crying for help? Do you hear him begging you to save him?" Her breath caught in her throat. The memories she had buried for years came flooding back. The sound of Ethan's voice trembling with fear. The sound of his screams. The sound of the line going dead. "I hear him," Helen whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Every night, I hear him." The man's voice softened. "Good." Helen wiped her tears away, her chest heaving with emotion. "But you don't have to do this," she pleaded. "You don't have to hurt her." The man sighed softly, almost regretfully. "Nah! It's not about hurting her, Helen. It's about hurting you." Suddenly, there was a loud crash through the phone. Marie screamed again, a raw, guttural sound that made Helen's stomach twist. Helen shot to her feet, knocking over her chair. "Stop it!" she screamed into the phone. "Please!" The man ignored her. Helen could hear him moving through the house, his footsteps slow and deliberate. 8 minutes, he whispered. That's all it would have taken. Helen sobbed, clutching the headset to her ear. Her entire body shook with grief and rage. Then, for the first time, Marie spoke clearly. Her voice was weak but determined. "Helen, don't blame yourself." Helen froze. "Marie," she whispered. There was a pause. Then, faintly, "He's not here for me. He's here for you." The words hit Helen like a punch to the gut. "What?" Marie sobbed softly. He said he'd kill me unless you confessed. But it's not about me, Helen. It never was." Helen's heart twisted painfully in her chest. "I'm so sorry, Marie," she whispered. Marie's voice trembled. "I don't want to die." Helen choked back a sob. "You won't. Help is coming. They'll be there any second." But even as she said the words, she knew they weren't true. The man spoke again, his voice calm and cold. "You hear that, Helen? She doesn't want to die." Helen gritted her teeth. "Please, just let her go." The man sighed. "Sorry. 8 minutes is up." And then the line went dead. The line went dead. Helen sat frozen, her heart pounding in her chest. The weight of the silence pressed down on her like a suffocating blanket. Marie was gone, and Helen had no idea if she was still alive. Her trembling hands reached for the police dispatch channel. Her voice was raw, cracking with desperation. "Unit 4, what's your status?" The officer's response was calm, detached, completely unaware of the horror unfolding on the other end. 1 minute out, 1 minute between life and death. But Helen knew, deep down, that a minute was too long. She couldn't shake the image of Marie, bleeding, terrified, alone. "Please," Helen whispered into the headset, as if begging time itself to speed up. The phone rang again. Helen's heart lurched. Her hand hovered over the button, her mind screaming at her not to answer. But she couldn't stop herself. She pressed the button and slipped the headset back on. "Helen," the man said softly. His voice was calmer now, more composed, like he'd finally gotten what he wanted. Helen gritted her teeth. "Where is she?" "She's right here," he replied. "But she's not saying much anymore." Helen clenched her fists. "You don't have to do this." The man ignored her plea. His tone was almost conversational, as if they were old friends catching up. "Do you know what it feels like to be forgotten, Helen? To cry out for help and realize no one is coming." Helen closed her eyes, his words cutting deep. She knew that feeling because it was her greatest fear. Every night she heard Ethan's voice in her dreams. Every night she relived the call. "I didn't forget you," she whispered. "I think about you every day." The man chuckled softly. "And what good did that do me?" Helen's mind raced. She needed to keep him talking, to stall, to buy time. The police would be there any second. But something about his voice made her stomach churn. It wasn't just rage driving him, it was grief. "I was just a kid," the man continued. His voice trembled slightly, the mask of composure slipping for a moment. "I begged you to save me, and you told me to wait. You told me to stay calm." Helen's throat tightened. She could still hear Ethan's voice, trembling with fear. "I thought the police would make it in time," she said quietly. "I thought I was doing the right thing." The man's voice hardened. "But they didn't make it in time, did they?" Suddenly, a distant noise came through the line, a muffled thud, followed by a weak, broken sob. "Marie!" Helen's voice cracked with desperation. "Marie, can you hear me?" The sob grew louder, more ragged. Helen's pulse quickened. She was still alive. "Marie, hold on," Helen said, her voice trembling. "The police are almost there." The man sighed. "Always so hopeful, aren't you?" Helen ignored him. "Marie, I need you to keep fighting. Do you hear me? Don't give up." Another sob, then faintly, I can't." Helen's chest heaved with emotion. "Yes, you can. Just hold on a little longer." But Marie's voice faded into a whisper. "It hurts." The man spoke again, his tone cold and final. "It's too late, Helen." Helen's mind reeled, panic setting in. She could hear sirens in the distance growing louder. "No," she whispered. "It's not too late. They're almost there." But the man's voice was calm. "You don't get it, do you? This was never about saving her." Helen's stomach twisted. "What do you mean?" The man chuckled darkly. "It's about making sure you never forget." The sirens were deafening now. The police had arrived. Helen clung to that fact, praying they would get to Marie in time. She heard the sound of a door being kicked open, officers shouting commands. But then came a new sound through the phone, the unmistakable click of a knife. Helen's heart stopped. "No." The man's voice softened, almost tender. "Goodbye, Helen." Then came a wet, sickening sound, and the line went dead. Helen ripped off her headset, gasping for air. Her hands shook uncontrollably as she stared at the blinking lights on her console. The office was deathly silent, save for her ragged breathing. Minutes passed, the phone remained silent. Then finally, the police dispatcher's voice crackled through her headset. "Unit 4 here. We've secured the scene." Helen grabbed the headset, her voice trembling. "Marie, is she—" There was a long pause, then quietly, "We found her." Helen's chest tightened. "And?" Another pause. Then the officer's voice softened. "She didn't make it." Helen collapsed back into her chair, the weight of the truth crushing her. The room spun around her, the air thick with grief. Marie was dead, and Helen knew it was her fault. The officer continued, his tone professional but grim. "We have a suspect in custody. We'll need you to come in for questioning." Helen barely registered his words. Her mind was stuck on the last thing Marie had said. "It hurts." She sat there for what felt like hours, staring at the phone. The sirens outside faded. The world moved on. But Helen remained frozen in place, trapped in the nightmare she'd never escape. Another voice lost, another life she couldn't save, and the ghost of Ethan Winters whispering in her ear, "You'll never forget." The sun rose slowly over the horizon, casting pale light through the windows of the 911 dispatch center. The soft glow did nothing to ease the suffocating weight that hung over the room. Helen sat at her desk, unmoving. Her hands were clenched in her lap, bloodless and trembling. Her eyes were fixed on the phone, on the blinking light that marked the last call she ever answered. But it was over now. The call was done. Marie was gone. The police had confirmed it. And yet, Helen couldn't move. She couldn't leave. Because the voice, the one that had haunted her for years, was still there, whispering in her mind. The office door opened, and Detective Mark Phillips walked in, his face lined with exhaustion. His eyes softened when he saw Helen, but there was no comfort in his gaze. "Helen." She didn't respond. Mark sighed and sat across from her, placing a file on the desk. The crime scene photos. He hesitated before speaking, his voice low and careful. "We have the suspect in custody." Helen blinked, finally looking up at him. Her voice was barely a whisper. "Who is he?" Mark opened the file, sliding a photo across the desk. A man in his 30s, disheveled and blood-stained. His eyes stared blankly into the camera, empty of emotion. Helen's breath caught in her throat. She recognized him. "That's Ethan's brother," she whispered. Mark nodded slowly. "His name is Jacob Winters." Helen stared at the photo, her mind spinning. The boy she couldn't save, his brother, now a man, had come back to make her pay. Mark continued. "He's not talking much, but he did say one thing when we arrested him." Helen's eyes flicked up, dread tightening in her chest. "What did he say?" Mark's expression darkened. "He said, 'Tell Helen it's done.'" The words hit her like a punch to the gut. Helen pushed the photo away, her hands trembling. Her throat felt tight, her breathing shallow. I thought I could stop it," she whispered. "I thought I could save her." Mark leaned forward, his voice soft. "Helen, this wasn't your fault." Her head snapped up, her eyes blazing with grief and rage. "It was. It's always been my fault." Mark flinched, but he didn't argue. There was no point. Helen had carried that guilt for years, and nothing he said would change it. The phone on her desk suddenly rang. Helen's heart stopped. Her eyes locked on the blinking light, dread crawling up her spine. The call shouldn't be possible. The case was over. Jacob was in custody. The line should be silent. But the phone rang again. Mark frowned. "Do you want me to get that?" Helen shook her head slowly. "No. I'll answer it." With trembling hands, she picked up the headset and pressed the button. 911, what's your emergency? There was no sound on the other end, just static. Helen's heart pounded in her chest. Her fingers tightened around the headset. Then, a familiar voice whispered through the static. "Helen." Her blood ran cold. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "This isn't possible." The voice was soft, broken. "You'll never forget." Helen ripped off the headset, gasping for air. Her hands shook violently as she dropped the headset onto the desk. Mark stood, concern etched across his face. "Helen, are you okay?" She didn't respond. Her gaze was locked on the phone, on the blinking light. Mark reached for her shoulder, but Helen recoiled. "Don't," she whispered. I need to be alone." Mark hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Okay, but call me if you need anything." He walked to the door, pausing for a moment before stepping out. "Take care of yourself, Helen." The door clicked shut behind him, leaving Helen alone in the silent room. She sat in the dim light, staring at the phone. Her mind spiraled into the past. Ethan's voice, Jacob's rage, Marie's screams. The ghosts of the dead surrounded her, whispering in her ears. "You'll never forget." The phone rang again. Helen didn't move. The light blinked, casting shadows across the room. She sat in silence, waiting for a call she would never escape. The end. Story 3. Pizza delivery, midnight shift. The rain came down in sheets, drumming on the roof of the car as Liam Wells squinted through the windshield. His wipers struggled to keep up, leaving streaks of water across the glass. The clock on the dashboard glowed 12:07 a.m. in eerie green light. The graveyard shift at Pietro's Pizza, the worst hours, the worst customers, and tonight, the worst weather. Liam tapped his fingers impatiently on the steering wheel as he pulled into a near-empty gas station. He grabbed a crumpled order slip from the passenger seat, his eyes scanning the address. 105 Harper Road. It was way out on the outskirts of town, past the main streets and deep into the old industrial district, a place most people avoided after dark. Last one for the night, Liam thought, tossing the slip back onto the seat. He had been working this job for 6 months, long enough to know that nothing good happened on late-night deliveries. He'd been stiffed on tips, barked at by drunk customers, and even chased by an overprotective German shepherd more than once. But something about this order felt different. The handwriting on the slip was shaky, hurried, and the name, Emily Price. It sounded familiar, though he couldn't place it. With a sigh, Liam pulled back onto the road, the headlights cutting through the rain-soaked darkness. The streets grew quieter the farther he drove, the buildings thinning out into empty lots and forgotten warehouses. Harper Road wasn't just isolated, it was abandoned. Liam glanced at the GPS on his phone, the blue dot creeping closer to the destination. Only a few more turns, then he could head home, crack open a beer, and forget this miserable night. But as he turned onto the final stretch of road, his stomach tightened. The house at 105 Harper Road stood at the end of the block, surrounded by tall, dead trees. The yard was overgrown and wild, the driveway cracked and full of puddles. The windows were dark, and the porch light flickered weakly, casting shadows that seemed to shift with the wind. Liam pulled into the driveway, killing the engine. For a moment, he sat in silence, listening to the rhythmic tapping of rain on the roof. The house felt wrong, like it had been forgotten by time. Grabbing the pizza box, Liam stepped out into the rain, the cold water soaking through his jacket. He trudged up the driveway, careful to avoid the deeper puddles, and made his way to the front door. The porch creaked under his weight. The smell of wet wood filled the air, mingling with the faint scent of rotting leaves. Liam knocked twice. The sound echoed through the empty street. For a long moment, nothing happened. No footsteps, no sound of locks turning. Just silence. Liam shivered, glancing over his shoulder. The street behind him was pitch black, illuminated only by the dim glow of his car's headlights. He knocked again, harder this time. Finally, the door creaked open. A woman stood in the doorway. Emily Price. She looked nervous. Her eyes darted toward the street before settling on Liam, her expression tight with unease. Her hair was damp and tangled, her clothes wrinkled and loose, as if she hadn't slept in days. But what struck Liam most was the fear in her eyes. It wasn't just anxiety, it was the look of someone being hunted. Liam forced a smile, holding up the pizza box. Pietro's Pizza, $24.95. Emily hesitated, glancing over her shoulder into the house. The shadows inside were deep and impenetrable, the hallway stretching into darkness. After a long pause, she pulled a few crumpled bills from her pocket and handed them to Liam, her fingers trembling slightly. As she took the pizza, her eyes met his. And then she asked the question, "Have you ever felt like you're being followed?" Liam blinked. "What?" The words hung in the air, heavy and strange. Her tone was serious, not casual, not playful. It was a warning. Not really," Liam said awkwardly, shifting on his feet. He tried to laugh it off. "Not unless I'm late on a delivery." Emily didn't smile. Her gaze lingered on him for a moment before she nodded slowly, almost to herself. "It's a terrible feeling." Without another word, she stepped back inside and closed the door. The lock clicked into place, leaving Liam standing alone on the porch, drenched and uneasy. Liam jogged back to his car, eager to be done with the night. The rain hammered harder, turning the windshield into a blur of water and streaked wiper marks. As he pulled out of the driveway, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Her words echoed in his mind. "Have you ever felt like you're being followed?" Liam tried to brush it off. Customers said weird things all the time. Maybe she was drunk, or paranoid. But deep down, he knew it wasn't that simple. As he drove through the dark, empty streets, his headlights caught movement. A figure stood on the sidewalk just at the edge of the light, tall, still, watching. Liam's breath caught in his throat. Did I just see that? He glanced in the rearview mirror. The figure was gone, just rain and shadows. Liam shook his head, forcing a laugh. "I'm losing it." But as he turned onto the main road, he couldn't shake the feeling. Something or someone was out there, watching. The next morning, Liam sat at his small kitchen table, eating dry cereal straight from the box. His apartment was silent, save for the distant hum of traffic outside. He absent-mindedly scrolled through his phone, already preparing himself for another night of deliveries. A news notification popped up on his screen. Missing local woman, last seen on Harper Road. Liam froze. His thumb hovered over the headline as his heart began to pound in his chest. Slowly, he clicked on the article. The screen loaded, revealing a grainy photo of a woman. Emily Price. Liam's stomach twisted. The article detailed how Emily's car had been found, abandoned near the old industrial district, her phone left inside. No sign of her, no leads. She was gone, and Liam knew he was the last person to see her alive. The cereal box tumbled from his hands, spilling across the table. His phone buzzed, snapping him out of his daze. It was a number he didn't recognize. Reluctantly, he answered. Hello? A voice on the other end was calm but firm. Liam Wells? Yeah, who's this? Detective Marcus Hale. I'm with the local precinct. I need to ask you some questions about a delivery you made last night. Liam's mouth went dry. Is this about that missing woman? There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. Yes, Emily Price. You were the last person to see her. An hour later, Liam found himself sitting in a cramped, dimly lit office at the police station. Detective Hale sat across from him, his sharp eyes watching Liam carefully. Hale was tall and broad-shouldered, with graying hair and a demeanor that screamed no nonsense. He flipped through a thin file on his desk, occasionally glancing up at Liam. You work at Pietro's Pizza, correct? Liam nodded. And you delivered to 105 Harper Road last night? Yeah. Hale leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. Tell me exactly what happened. Liam recounted the delivery, the long drive, the rundown house, the strange conversation. He hesitated for a moment before mentioning Emily's question. She asked me if I ever felt like I was being followed. Hale raised an eyebrow. Did she say anything else? Liam shook his head. No, that's it. She seemed nervous, like she was scared of something. Hale leaned back in his chair, tapping a pen against the desk. Did you notice anyone else around? Any cars following you? Liam thought about the figure he saw on the sidewalk. The memory sent a chill down his spine. He opened his mouth to mention it, but stopped. No, it was probably nothing, just a trick of the light. No, Liam said quietly. I didn't see anyone. Hale nodded slowly, closing the file. If you remember anything else, call me. He handed Liam a business card, his gaze lingering for a moment. And be careful, Liam. These things, they don't always end well. Liam swallowed hard, pocketing the card. As he left the station, Hale's words echoed in his mind. They don't always end well. That evening, Liam was back on his delivery route. The rain had cleared, but the sky remained dark and heavy. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Every time he glanced in his rearview mirror, he expected to see a car following him. Every dark corner seemed to hide a shadow. Every sound felt too loud, too close. As he pulled into a customer's driveway, his phone buzzed again. Unknown number. His stomach clenched. Reluctantly, he answered. Hello? For a moment, there was nothing but static. Then, faintly, Liam. His blood ran cold. Who is this? More static. Then, you were the last to see her. Now you're next. The call ended abruptly. Liam sat frozen, the phone clutched in his hand. His heart pounded in his chest as his mind raced. Was it a prank? A cruel joke? But something about the voice felt familiar. Too familiar. That night, Liam couldn't sleep. He sat at his kitchen table, the business card from Detective Hale resting in front of him. He turned it over in his hands, debating whether to call, but deep down, he knew no one could help him. Something was coming for him, something that couldn't be stopped. Around midnight, Liam finally crawled into bed, exhausted. The apartment was dark, the only light coming from the street lamp outside his window. He lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet hum of the city. His mind drifted back to Emily's anxious face. Have you ever felt like you're being followed? Suddenly, a noise outside caught his attention. A soft, shuffling sound. Liam sat up, his heart racing. He walked to the window and pulled back the curtain. His breath caught in his throat. Across the street, a figure stood under the street lamp, tall, still, watching. The light cast long shadows, obscuring the figure's face, but Liam could feel its gaze locked on him. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, slowly, the figure raised a hand and pointed directly at Liam. The figure didn't move. It stood perfectly still under the street lamp, its shadow stretching unnaturally long across the pavement. The light flickered, casting the scene in broken fragments of darkness and pale yellow glow. Liam couldn't breathe. His heart pounded in his chest as he gripped the windowsill, staring down at the motionless figure. Was it a man? A shadow? Something about it was off, unnatural. Slowly the figure lowered its hand. The gesture was deliberate, almost mechanical. And then, just as the light flickered again, the figure was gone. Liam stumbled backward, gasping for air. He rubbed his eyes, his hands trembling. Did I imagine that? He rushed back to the window, scanning the street below. The street lamp continued to hum, casting its weak glow across the empty sidewalk. There was no sign of anyone, but Liam couldn't shake the feeling. Someone had been there, someone had seen him, and whoever, or whatever, it wasn't gone. It was just waiting. Liam barely slept. When his alarm went off, he dragged himself out of bed, his body aching from exhaustion. The events of the night before clung to him like a fog, muddling his thoughts. He made a pot of coffee and sat at the kitchen table, staring blankly at the business card from Detective Hale. The voice from the phone call echoed in his mind. You were the last to see her, now you're next. Liam ran a hand through his hair, his fingers tugging at the strands. He needed answers. He couldn't sit here, waiting for something to happen. He couldn't let the fear consume him. With shaking hands, he dialed Detective Hale's number. Hale! The detective's voice was gruff, clipped. Liam took a deep breath, steadying himself. It's Liam Wells, the delivery driver. There was a pause on the other end. Liam, what can I do for you? Liam hesitated, his eyes drifting to the window. The street outside was quiet, but he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I think someone's following me. Hale's tone shifted, becoming more serious. What makes you say that? There was someone outside my apartment last night, just standing there, watching me. Another pause. And you're sure it wasn't just someone passing by? Liam shook his head, even though Hale couldn't see him. No, it wasn't like that. They were waiting for me. Hale sighed. I'll send a patrol car by your place tonight. In the meantime, keep your doors locked, and call me if anything else happens. After the call, Liam couldn't sit still. Something pulled him back to Harper Road, to Emily Price's house. He needed to know more. What was she afraid of? Why did she ask him that question? And why did she disappear the same night? The house looked even worse in the daylight. The paint was peeling and cracked, the windows coated in a thin layer of grime. The yard, overgrown and wild, seemed to crawl toward the house, like the earth itself was trying to reclaim it. Liam parked his car and walked slowly up the driveway, his footsteps crunching over wet gravel. The front door was unlocked. He pushed it open, stepping into the dark, musty interior. The air inside was thick with dust, and the smell of rotting wood hung heavily in the air. As he moved through the house, the silence pressed down on him. There was no sign of struggle, no sign that anything had happened here. Just emptiness. In the living room, a notebook lay on the coffee table. The cover was worn, the edges frayed. Liam picked it up, flipping it open to the first page. The handwriting was hurried, frantic. Notes, dates, and sketches filled the pages, but one word appeared over and over again. Watcher. Liam's pulse quickened as he flipped through the notebook. The entries were disjointed, jumping between descriptions of shadows, paranoia, and strange encounters. But one page stopped him cold. It was a sketch of a figure, tall, thin, faceless. And beneath the sketch, Emily had scrawled a message in bold, jagged letters. He won't stop until he finds a new target. Liam's hands trembled as he stared at the words. Suddenly, the floor creaked behind him. Liam spun around, his heart pounding. The room was empty, but the air felt different. He glanced at the window, his breath catching in his throat. There, on the other side of the glass, stood the watcher, still, silent, watching. Liam stumbled backward, his legs shaking. When he blinked, the figure was gone. Liam didn't remember leaving the house. His mind was a blur, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. The journal sat on the passenger seat, its pages fluttering as the wind from the open window caught them. He won't stop until he finds a new target. Liam's thoughts spiraled. Emily was the target. Now it's me. As he pulled into his apartment complex, the street lamp outside flickered. Liam glanced in his rearview mirror. For a brief moment, he saw the watcher standing in the distance. Back inside his apartment, Liam locked every door and window. He pulled the curtain shut, blocking out the streetlight. But no matter what he did, he couldn't shake the feeling. The watcher was still out there. He sat at the kitchen table, staring at the journal. Suddenly, his phone buzzed. Unknown number. Liam's heart stopped. The phone buzzed again. He picked it up, his hand trembling, and answered. Hello? There was silence on the other end, then softly. Liam, it's your turn. Liam's hand shook as he gripped the phone. Liam, It's your turn." The voice was soft, distant, crackling through the static like a whisper from another world. It was his name, spoken slowly, deliberately. But the voice was wrong. It wasn't Emily. It wasn't Detective Hale. It wasn't anyone Liam knew. It was him. His own voice, twisted, warped, cold. Liam dropped the phone, stumbling back from the table. It hit the floor with a dull thud, the screen still glowing. He pressed his back against the wall, staring at the phone as if it might spring to life and attack him. No, 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 no. He grabbed his head, his thoughts spinning. Was he losing his mind? Was this paranoia? Or was someone, or something, really toying with him? The silence was unbearable, and then the knocking started. Tap, tap, tap. Liam froze. The knocking came from his front door, slow and rhythmic. Tap, tap, tap. It wasn't frantic. It wasn't impatient. It was calculated. Controlled. Like whoever was on the other side knew he was already terrified. Liam stared at the door, his chest heaving. Don't open it. Don't open it. But something about the sound felt familiar. It tugged at a buried memory, something he couldn't quite place. And then he remembered. The knocking was exactly the same as the sound he'd heard at Emily Price's house. When he'd knocked on her door that night, it had echoed through the empty street. And now, someone was knocking the same way. Liam's blood ran cold. The knocking stopped. For a long moment, there was only silence. Liam stood there, his heart pounding in his ears. His gaze stayed fixed on the door, waiting for the knocking to start again. But instead, a piece of paper slid under the door. It was thin and yellowed with age, the edges frayed. Liam stared at it for a long time, before slowly approaching. He crouched down, his fingers trembling as he picked it up. There was a single word written on it, in bold, jagged letters. Watch! Liam stumbled backward, dropping the paper. Nah! His breathing quickened, and the walls of the apartment seemed to close in around him. The room felt too small, too dark. Suddenly, his phone buzzed again. He didn't want to answer it. He knew what he'd hear, but the buzzing wouldn't stop. Reluctantly, he picked it up and answered. Hello? There was no static this time, no whisper, just a chilling silence, and then, look outside. Liam's heart nearly stopped. He didn't want to look. Don't do it, just hang up. But his body moved on its own, driven by a terrible curiosity. He walked to the window and pulled back the curtain. The street was empty. The sidewalk was slick with rain, the street lamp flickering faintly. But just as Liam started to relax, he saw it. The Watcher. Standing across the street, perfectly still, perfectly silent, watching. Liam stumbled backward, his chest heaving. The figure didn't move. It didn't step closer. It just stood there, as if it had all the time in the world. Suddenly, the lights in the apartment flickered. The air grew cold, the shadows on the walls stretching longer, darker. Liam backed into the kitchen, grabbing a knife from the counter. His hands shook as he gripped it, the cold steel pressing against his palm. Suddenly, the phone rang again. Liam stared at it, dread pooling in his stomach. He didn't want to answer. He couldn't. But the ringing wouldn't stop. With trembling hands, he picked up the phone and brought it to his ear. This time, there was no voice. Just breathing. Slow, deliberate, and then, finally, I'm inside. Liam's blood ran cold. He spun around, knife in hand, scanning the dark corners of the apartment. The shadows seemed to move. Every dark space looked like it was hiding something. He backed toward the front door, his breath coming in short, panicked bursts. The door was locked, but suddenly, it didn't feel like enough. Liam's mind spiraled. Was the Watcher inside? Was it a hallucination? Was he losing his grip on reality? The phone buzzed again, a new text message. He hesitated before opening it. The message contained a single image. It was a photo of him, taken through the window. Liam's heart stopped. He looked toward the window, his hands shaking. There was no one there, no sign of anyone. But when he glanced back at his phone, another message had appeared. It read, "Don't turn around." Liam froze. His entire body tensed as he stared at the words, his mind racing. There's no one behind me. There's no one behind me. But he couldn't shake the feeling. The air felt different, heavy, cold, charged. And then slowly, he turned. There, in the middle of his apartment, stood the Watcher, perfectly still, perfectly silent, watching. The Watcher stood in the middle of the room, unmoving. Its presence consumed the space, tall, thin, featureless. The dim light from the street lamp outside cast long, jagged shadows across the walls, making it seem larger than life. Liam couldn't breathe. His chest heaved as panic gripped his entire body. His knuckles turned white as he clutched the knife, holding it out in front of him like a lifeline. This isn't real. This isn't happening. But the figure didn't vanish. It didn't dissolve into a hallucination or fade like a bad dream. It was there, and it was watching. For what felt like an eternity, neither of them moved. Then slowly, the Watcher tilted its head. The movement was unnatural, mechanical, as if it were studying Liam like a curious animal. "What do you want?" Liam's voice cracked, barely a whisper. The Watcher didn't answer. It didn't need to. The silence was the answer, and the silence was worse than words. Suddenly, the lights flickered. The shadows on the walls twisted and stretched, creating grotesque shapes that seemed to crawl toward Liam. The Watcher took a single step forward. Liam backed up, his heart pounding in his chest. "Stay back," he whispered, his voice trembling. "I swear I'll—" The words died in his throat, because the Watcher wasn't moving anymore. It was closer now. Too close. Liam's mind spiraled. Flashes of Emily Price's anxious face flickered through his thoughts, like a broken film reel. Her words echoed in his mind, over and over. "Have you ever felt like you're being followed?" Suddenly, the memory twisted. In his mind's eye, it wasn't Emily anymore. It was himself, standing on that porch holding the pizza box, asking the question in his own voice. "Have you ever felt like you're being followed?" Liam shook his head, tears stinging his eyes. "This isn't real! It's not real!" But the memories kept twisting. He remembered knocking on Emily's door, but this time, when the door opened, there was no Emily. There was only the Watcher. It stood there in the doorway, silent and waiting. Liam stumbled back, clutching his head. No, that's not how it happened. But his mind wouldn't stop. The memories kept playing, looping, changing. The Watcher was always there, at Emily's house, in the street, in his apartment. It was always watching, and it always would be. Suddenly, the phone buzzed on the table. The sound was sharp and jarring, cutting through the suffocating silence. Liam stared at it, his breath quickening. He didn't want to answer. He couldn't, but the buzzing wouldn't stop. Slowly, with shaking hands, he reached for the phone. The screen read, "Unknown number." Liam pressed accept, lifting the phone to his ear. "Hello?" he whispered. The voice on the other end was calm, measured. "You know what happens next." Liam squeezed his eyes shut, his chest tightening. "Please," he whispered, "just tell me what you want." There was a pause. Then softly, "Watch." As the word echoed through the phone, the room around Liam began to shift. The walls warped and cracked, peeling back to reveal charred wood and blackened plaster. The air grew thick with the scent of smoke and decay. Liam backed into the corner, clutching the knife to his chest. The Watcher stood in the center of it all. The shadows flickered, and suddenly there were more figures, shapes moving in the darkness, watching, waiting, whispering. Liam covered his ears, tears streaming down his face. "Leave me alone," he screamed, but the whispers only grew louder. "You were the last to see her. You're next. Watch." Liam's knees buckled, and he collapsed to the floor. The shadows closed in around him, and the whispers faded into silence. Liam lifted his head, gasping for air. The apartment was empty again. Silent, normal. Except for one thing. The journal sat on the floor in front of him. He hadn't brought it inside. He'd left it in his car. But now it was here. Slowly he reached out, flipping it open. A new entry had been added. The handwriting was his. It read, "I saw her, I watched her, I followed her." Liam stared at the words, his mind reeling. No, I didn't. But as he flipped through the pages, the truth became clear. He wasn't just the last person to see Emily alive. He was the reason she was gone. Liam sat frozen on the floor, staring at the journal in his hands. The words on the page burned into his mind. "I saw her, I watched her, I followed her." It wasn't possible. He hadn't written that. Had he? The handwriting was his. The letters slanted the same way. The loops, the strokes. It was undeniably his. Liam's breath came in short, ragged bursts. No, this isn't real. But deep down, a part of him knew. It had always been there, the unease, the confusion, the missing memories. And now, the truth was clawing its way to the surface. Desperate for answers, Liam flipped through the journal's pages. Most of it was filled with Emily's frantic handwriting, notes about the Watcher, strange occurrences, and the feeling of being followed. But the farther he flipped, the more familiar the handwriting became. It was his, page after page, entry after entry. It wasn't just Emily's journal, it was his too. The entries were disturbing, fragmented. "I see her every night. She doesn't know I'm there. She asked me if I felt it. She knows. I can't stop watching." Liam's hands trembled as he flipped to the final page. The last entry was short, just a single sentence. She had to disappear. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. Liam jolted, his heart leaping into his throat. Tap, tap, tap. The same slow, deliberate rhythm he'd heard before. He stumbled to his feet, clutching the knife tightly in his hand. His mind raced. Don't open it! Don't open it! But the knock came again. Tap, tap, tap. And this time, a voice followed. Liam, it's Detective Hale. Liam crept toward the door, his body tense. What does Hale want? Why is he here? Taking a deep breath, he unlocked the door and pulled it open. Detective Marcus Hale stood on the other side. His expression was grim, his eyes locked on Liam. We need to talk. Liam hesitated. What's this about? Hale didn't answer. Instead, he stepped inside, closing the door behind him. The two men stood in tense silence, the air between them thick with unspoken truths. Finally, Hale spoke. Emily Price, she's not missing, Liam. Liam blinked, his mind struggling to process the words. What do you mean? Hale's gaze didn't waver. We found her body this morning. Liam's stomach twisted into a knot. No, that's not possible. She was found near Harper Road, Hale continued, cutting him off. In the woods behind her house. Someone buried her there. Liam shook his head, his breathing quickening. I didn't do anything. I was just the delivery guy. You were the last person to see her alive, Hale said softly. His voice wasn't accusatory, it was almost sympathetic. And now, you're the only person who can tell us what happened. Liam stumbled backward, his mind spiraling. The journal entries flashed through his thoughts. I saw her. I watched her. I followed her. She had to disappear. I didn't write that, he whispered. I swear I didn't. Hale took a step closer. Then who did? Liam opened his mouth to respond, but he couldn't, because he didn't know. Or maybe, deep down, he did. Hale's voice softened. What's happening to you, Liam? You're not acting like yourself. Liam's eyes darted to the window. In the glass, he saw his reflection. But it wasn't just him. The watcher stood behind him, still, silent, watching. Liam spun around, but the room was empty. Liam dropped the knife, collapsing to his knees. I don't know what's real anymore, he whispered, his voice breaking. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Hale knelt in front of him, his expression calm but serious. It's not in your head, Liam. Whatever you're dealing with, it's real. But you have to tell me the truth. Liam's gaze flicked to the journal lying on the floor. It's all in there, he said quietly. The journal. It wasn't just hers. I've been writing in it too. Hale frowned, picking up the journal. He flipped through the pages, his expression darkening as he read. Finally, he closed it and looked at Liam. We need to go to Harper Road. The drive to Harper Road was silent. Liam sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window. The world outside seemed muted, the trees and buildings blurring together under the dull gray sky. Detective Hale gripped the steering wheel tightly, his gaze focused on the road ahead. Neither of them spoke. The journal sat on Hale's lap, its cover worn and stained. Liam couldn't bring himself to look at it. The words inside haunted him. They felt like a noose tightening around his neck. As they approached Emily Price's house, Liam's chest tightened. The house stood at the end of the road, just as he remembered it, isolated, crumbling, surrounded by dead trees. The driveway was slick with mud, the air heavy with the scent of rain and earth. Hale parked the car and turned to Liam. Are you ready? Liam nodded slowly, though he wasn't sure he'd ever be ready. They made their way toward the woods behind the house. The trees loomed overhead, their bare branches twisting like gnarled fingers. The ground beneath their feet was soft and wet, each step sinking slightly into the mud. As they walked deeper into the woods, Liam's mind raced, memories flickered, the knock at Emily's door, the sound of her voice, her question. Have you ever felt like you're being followed? The words played over and over in his head, like a broken record. And then, a new memory surfaced. Suddenly, Liam stopped, his breath caught in his throat as the memory unfolded, vivid and cruel. It was that night. The delivery. He remembered knocking on Emily's door, just as before. But this time, he remembered what happened after. Emily had opened the door, her eyes wide with fear. It's you, she'd whispered. Liam frowned. Excuse me? She stepped back, shaking her head. You're the one. You've been watching me. Liam had laughed, confused. I think you've got the wrong... But she slammed the door, and as Liam stood there, stunned, something inside him snapped. He pounded on the door, harder, louder. "Open the door!" he shouted, his voice echoing through the empty street. The door didn't open. Liam's heart raced. His mind spun. Why was she acting like this? Why was she afraid of him? And then he realized something. She wasn't wrong. The Watcher. It wasn't someone else. It was him. He had been following her, watching her. He just hadn't realized it. Hale's voice snapped him back to the present. "Liam, over here!" Liam turned to see Hale standing near a clearing, pointing to a patch of disturbed earth. A shallow grave. Liam's legs trembled as he approached. The ground was uneven, muddy. The rain had washed away most of the dirt, revealing something beneath the surface. Emily's hand. Liam collapsed to his knees, his stomach twisting. He retched, gasping for air, tears streaming down his face. "No, no, no, no." Hale knelt beside him, his voice calm but firm. "You need to tell me the truth, Liam." Liam shook his head violently. "I didn't do this. I didn't..." But the memories wouldn't stop. He remembered grabbing the shovel. He remembered dragging Emily's body through the woods. He remembered the weight of the dirt as he shoveled it over her. She had to disappear. The words echoed in his mind. Liam sobbed, his hands clutching the muddy earth. I don't remember why I did it." But he did. Deep down, he knew. Emily had been right. She'd sensed it. She'd seen it. The darkness inside him, the Watcher, it had always been there. It wasn't a person following him. It was him. Hale stood slowly, his expression grim. "We'll need to take you in, Liam." Liam didn't resist. There was no point. He knew what he'd done, and he knew there was no going back. As Hale escorted Liam back toward the car, Liam glanced over his shoulder. The woods were still, silent. But just for a moment, he saw it. The Watcher. Standing at the edge of the trees. Still, silent, watching. And this time, it looked exactly like him. The ride back to the station was silent. Liam sat in the back of Hale's car, his hands cuffed in front of him. The cold metal bit into his wrists, but he barely felt it. His mind was elsewhere, spiraling through the fragmented memories of that night. He had buried her. He had watched her. And now, he couldn't deny it any longer. The Watcher wasn't a shadowy figure. It wasn't something following him. It was him. It had always been him. The car pulled into the police station parking lot, and Hale killed the engine. For a moment, they sat in tense silence, the rain pattering softly on the windshield. Hale turned, his gaze piercing but calm. "We'll figure this out, Liam." Liam shook his head, tears welling in his eyes. "There's nothing to figure out." Inside the station, Liam sat alone in a small interrogation room. The walls were bare and gray, the fluorescent light above buzzing faintly. He stared down at his hands, trembling slightly. Every time he blinked, he saw her face. Emily Price, the fear in her eyes, the way her lips trembled when she asked him, "Have you ever felt like you're being followed?" The door opened, and Detective Hale stepped inside, carrying the journal. He set it down on the table between them, the sound echoing through the quiet room. Hale sat across from Liam, folding his hands. "Tell me what happened." Liam stared at the journal, his mind racing. Finally, he spoke. I didn't mean to hurt her." His voice was barely a whisper, cracking with emotion. "I didn't even know what I was doing. It was like I was watching myself, like I wasn't in control." Hale leaned forward. "Watching yourself?" Liam nodded, his gaze distant. "It felt like someone else was pulling the strings, like I was just there, watching it happen." Hale tapped the journal with his finger. "And you wrote this?" Liam hesitated, his breath catching. "I don't remember writing it, but it's my handwriting." His voice broke as he continued. "I've been seeing things, hearing things. There's someone, or something, following me. It looks like me, it feels like me, but it's not me." Hale's expression darkened. "You're talking about the Watcher." Liam's head snapped up. "You know about it?" Hale nodded slowly. "We've seen cases like this before, people claiming they're being followed by something that looks like them. It starts small, paranoia, strange coincidences." Hale's gaze sharpened. "And then it takes over." Liam's heart pounded. "What do you mean it takes over?" Hale's voice was calm, measured. "It's not an external force, Liam. It's you. It's the part of you that you've been ignoring. The darker side, the part that watches, the part that waits." Liam shook his head violently. No, I'm not a killer." Hale leaned back, his expression grim. You're not yet. Suddenly, the lights in the room flickered. Liam stiffened, his breath quickening. Did you see that? Hale didn't react. The lights flickered again, and then the shadows in the room shifted. A figure appeared in the corner, still, silent, watching. Liam's blood ran cold. It's here. Hale tilted his head, his expression oddly calm. What do you see, Liam? Liam pointed toward the corner, his hand trembling. It's the Watcher. It's right there. Hale leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. Liam, there's no one there. Liam's breath came in short gasps. You don't see it? Hale shook his head. Liam turned back to the corner, his heart pounding in his chest. The figure stepped forward, moving slowly into the flickering light. And as it did, Liam finally saw its face. It was him. The same clothes, the same features, but the expression was empty, emotionless. The Watcher stared at him, its hollow eyes piercing through him. Liam's hands trembled. No, this isn't real? The Watcher tilted its head, mirroring Liam's movements. And then it spoke. It's time, Liam. Liam stumbled back from the table, tears streaming down his face. No, I'm not like you. The Watcher stepped closer. You've always been like me. Liam collapsed to the floor, sobbing. The lights flickered one last time, and when they steadied, the Watcher was gone. But Liam knew it hadn't left. It was inside him now, and it would always be. Weeks later, a new delivery driver at Pietro's Pizza gets an order to Harper Road. He drives through the empty streets whistling to himself. When he arrives at the house, he knocks on the door. The door opens. Liam Wells stands in the doorway, still, silent, watching. Have you ever felt like you're being followed? Liam asks, his voice cold. The driver frowns. No, why? Liam smiles faintly. You will. The end. Please subscribe if you have enjoyed this story.